beating Dark Souls 3 without getting hit by any of the bosses. Additionally, doing all of that as a mage. Our journey begins with me selecting my character and beginning with fire bombs as my burial gift. We would need these for later. I got some Titanite Shard and some fire bombs, and then attempted to beat Iudex Gundyr. Of course, I have to show the boss fight so that you can see I don't get hit during it. But I thought I would take a moment here to explain the rules of this challenge video. I am allowed to get hit by enemies to and from the boss fights in each area. The only thing that I am not allowed to get hit by is a boss. If I get hit by a boss, I have to restart and try again. The only way I can move on from the boss is if I beat them without getting hit. I know from the looks of things, this challenge may not seem that hard so far, but later on in the video, there are going to be bosses that I try to beat a lot of times before I am successful. To beat Gundyr, I simply stayed at a long range and casted my soul arrows at him from afar. This was going pretty well, and then he morphed into his second stage. I casted spell after spell after spell, until finally, with one last spell, I was able to break his poise and finish him off. This was the first of many bosses that I would have to beat to complete this challenge. But I would need some more things before I faced off against Vordit. I did the tree jump outside Firelink Shrine so I could get access to an Estus Shard and the Silver Serpent Ring. One of these would boost my Estus and the other would give me more souls from fallen enemies. Using all of the souls I got from Gundyr, I decided to pump my points into intelligence so that I did more magic damage. The High Wall of Lothric was the next stop. I used my black fire bombs I picked as my starting gift to eliminate this enemy and claim their Titanite Shard. I repeated the process for the other enemy in the area, and then headed to Firelink Shrine. I upgraded my Catalyst, and put the rest of my souls into leveling up my intelligence. And now, it was time to take on Vordit. But Dark Souls is a very, 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 very hard game. It did take a couple of tries, but eventually I was able to best him. I started the fight with 3 heavy soul arrows while backstepping so he wouldn't hit me with his first move. I dodged his swipe and retaliated with another soul arrow, being careful to dodge his poke attacks which had more range than others. I hit him some more, ready for him to transition to his second phase. Once I did, I attacked a little bit, but I was being wary of his charge attacks. Once those were done, I switched to my heavy soul arrow, knowing now would be a good time to punish him. And before I knew it, I had felled the beast. There are 25 bosses in Dark Souls 3, and I had only just beat my second one. There was still a long way to go. I spoke to Jarl of Londor and then killed myself a whole bunch of times so that I could get 5 free level ups, all of which went towards my intelligence. I purchased the Soul Greatsword and the Magic Weapon, 2 powerful spells I'd probably be using later on. I traveled to the next area and then Farron Keep after that. I got 2 Estus Shards, a whole lot of Titanite Shards, a Bone Shard, the Chloranthy Ring, and the Farron Coal. Once I had those, I extinguished the fires in Farron Keep, and I obtained the Sage Ring, the Lingering Dragon Crest Ring, the Crown of Dusk, the Sage Scroll, the Great Soul Arrow, and the Great Heavy Soul Arrow. Now that I would have much more powerful magic attacks using all of those items, it was time to face off against the Abyss Watchers. My strategy was to stay far away from him during the first phase and be very careful of any duplicate enemies that were created. Once I heard the first enemy spawning in, the plan was to wait for the second, red-eyed one to spawn as well, so that they fought each other and I could fight the boss. I had cleared the first stage with the help of my magic by staying at longer ranges. But would this be enough for the second phase? The simple answer is yes. Yes, it would. All I did was punish the attacks that I knew I was able to punish without the risk of him hitting me with another attack on the combo. In fact, for this boss, I actually find the second stage to be easier than the first. The only thing that changes is watching out for longer combos and the fire that gives him a little bit of extra range on most of his moves. While this boss didn't pose much of a challenge, the next one certainly would. Well, not Wolnir to clarify, because he is one of the easiest bosses in the game for the most part. There wasn't really much to do in the catacombs, there isn't much in there, so I'm just going to skip straight to the fight. To defeat High Lord Wolnir, all you have to do is destroy his 3 bracelets. He has 2 on his left hand and 1 on his right. Normally strength or dex builds can make very short work of this boss, but since I'm a mage, it took me a little bit longer. I was using Great Magic Weapon to get some extra damage in there though. It was around this time that I started to realize sticking with the starter weapon for the sorcerer probably wasn't going to work out. There are other enemies and bosses later on that are also strong to magic, so I can't rely fully on sorcery. The only attack I didn't have much confidence in dodging and just kind of hoped he didn't do was the one he just did. I like to call it his crawly run attack. With that now out of the way though, I wasn't super worried about what was to come. I got one of his bracelets low, and before I could finish it off, he started doing the sword move. Instead of waiting for lots of skeletons to come out, I simply used a spell. As Wolnir lost his grip and slid towards the darkness, I was thinking about how I would beat the Crystal Sages. Originally, I thought using the Pestilent Mist would be a good way to go. Since they have such high magic damage, it can be quite annoying to kill them as a mage using lots and lots of sorceries. I thought Pestilent Mist would be a good way to kind of cheese the boss. However, I tried this strategy multiple times, and each time I would end up accidentally damaging myself with the spell. That's something I didn't really want to do. I didn't think using Great Magic Weapon would do enough damage against them. The more damage I did, the less amount of attacks that I would have to dodge, meaning I would probably have a higher survival rate. But it turns out I was doing pretty good damage. All I had to do now was watch out for the boss's replicas, hit them once and they would disappear, or just go straight to the source and hit them instead. You're probably going to see me successfully guess more or less where they're going to spawn a couple of times, and I do that just by going to the opposite side of where they previously were. This just allowed me to be more prepared and kill them a little bit faster. I journeyed onward, collecting essentials such as Estus and Undead Bone Shards, before facing off against the hardest enemy in the game. At least, when you're doing this challenge run. I genuinely tried beating this boss without getting hit upwards of 30 times and failed every single time. My original tactic was run straight towards them and kind of stay around them for the entire fight. But I realized this wasn't working because when the second phase happened and the big boss spawned in, all of the other smaller enemies would just hurl fireballs at me and a stray one would just always seem to catch me. So what I started doing instead was playing the first phase slow and baiting most of the enemies away from where the boss during the phase 2 section would spawn. This way, when phase 2 happened, it would be much easier for me to dodge any and all incoming attacks, and also I'd be able to just focus on fewer enemies. If you're wondering where I got the cell swords from, I got them earlier on in the video, next to where I obtained the Farron Coal. I did also have to level up my strength just a little bit to be able to use them. Additionally, I put some points into dexterity as well, and infused the cell swords with a sharp gem. This would both make them do more damage and make my casting speed faster. Once I had cleared the first stage of the boss fight, I immediately rushed straight to where the second phase boss would spawn. Now would be the perfect time to strike and dish out as much damage as I possibly could. I first eliminated the enemies that would spawn alongside the boss, so there was a lower chance of me getting hit by them. However, I realized the enemies I baited around the back of the boss room started making their way back. Also, more newer enemies were just spawning right where the boss was as well. I didn't have much time, but I didn't end up needing it either. This was honestly the most annoying boss I fought in this entire challenge run, and I'm pretty sure it's the one that took me the most tries as well, so beating it made me feel like I'd be able to beat the whole game without much of an issue. I made sure I obtained the Magic Clutch Ring, which boosted my sorceries, as well as the Soul Spear, which is the most powerful sorcery I would have access to for the moment. So I actually beat the old Demon King before I beat the Deacons of the Deep, mainly just so I could get a couple of extra souls and some large Titanite shards. But then I remembered I had to show myself beating all of the bosses in the game, so I'm just going to put it here instead. And to save time, I'm going to put Yorm right beside him. Both of these bosses were very, very easy. Yorm actually did take me a couple of tries because I just messed up and he does lots of damage, but both were very easy for the most part. For the old Demon King, I just stayed at a mid-range, just out of range of his attacks, and just used my spells on him. This isn't a boss I've fought that much because it is optional and he doesn't really give you anything good, so I wasn't really familiar with his attack patterns, but luckily they weren't that hard to read or to dodge. Since I had previously died to Yorm a couple times, I already had the Storm Ruler. This allowed me to charge up an attack with it before I went into the boss room and just used that straight away. With the old Demon King, I found an effective strategy to just run circles around the giant kind of tree thing in the middle of the room, and there wasn't really so much that he could do in retaliation. I'll speed this up just a little bit and let the rest of these clips play out. These were both just two of the easiest bosses in the game. Honestly, Yorm is maybe even easier than Gundyr, and the old Demon King, I don't know if he was having a bad day or something, but he really didn't do a whole lot with his attacks. I obtained another ring that made my sorceries more powerful, and then decided it was time to take on Pontiff. This boss did take a couple of tries, but I was actually surprised at how much damage I was doing. I found a pretty effective technique was to just use Soul Spears until they entered their second phase. I stayed at a long range and kept casting spells until they were at about half HP. Once they were, I replenished my Estus and got ready to kill the Pontiff's duplicate. I found that this would be easier to do with my Cell Swords infused with Crystal Magic Weapon. I made short work of the duplicate and then went back to staying at a longer range. From here on out, all I had to do was dodge the Pontiff's moves and use my Soul Spears at longer ranges and my Cell Swords at the closer ones. It was a little bit tricky switching between the different ranges throughout the fight and learning the two different kind of movesets that the Pontiff would have, but eventually it paid off and I was able to beat them. Since Aldrich had pretty high magic resistance, I decided I was going to take on the Dancer instead. After that, I also took on the Curse Rotted Greatwood. I am pairing these bosses together because I find them both to be about as easy as each other. This is because when I started playing Dark Souls 3, one time I accidentally killed this NPC that causes the Dancer boss fight to activate, and even though I was extremely underleveled with like a +2 weapon and I was probably about level 30, I kept fighting the Dancer until I was able to beat them at a very low level. So I naturally became really good at this Dancer boss fight, and you'll see here I actually do end up beating them very first attempt. And then afterwards I just fought the Curse Rotted Greatwood, but neither of these boss fights were too difficult and I did beat them both first try. Next was the Dragon Slayer armor. Now this boss I did find fairly difficult. It wasn't because of the dragons that start happening towards the end of the fight or anything like that. It was just because a lot of his moves, especially one of his shield bashes, comes out very, very quickly and was just really, really hard to dodge in time sometimes. But eventually I did end up getting the fight down pretty well, and I was using my sellswords here just because I thought it would be easier to stay at the closer ranges. And in the end, it wasn't so difficult. It did take me a good few tries, maybe about 20, and sometimes his shield bashes were super annoying to play against. The most annoying thing about this boss fight by far was the run-up to it. The run-up took ages. It's only like one little small elevator, but the elevator takes so long to go up and down. It was like honestly driving me mental. But as you can see here, I was able to like punish every single attack, and I did make pretty short work of him in the end. Now we have both Osiris and the Ancient Wyvern, or Wyvern, or however you want to pronounce it. I'm putting these two together because they were both really annoying. There is a cheese for the Ancient Wyvern where you just do a jumping attack on his head and you can insta-kill him really quickly, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't really want to cheese any of the bosses for this challenge run, so I like went the whole way. I did the whole boss fight the way most people usually do it first try, and it was super annoying because there's so many enemies that can just hit you, but eventually I was able to kind of map out a path where a lot of the enemies just don't aggro. There was a little bit of RNG towards the ladder that I'm going to cross in a minute, but for the most part, it went pretty okay. Osiris had a couple of annoying moves. One of them was his kind of mist attack. He's got like a version of Pestilent Mist, and sometimes that would just damage me even though I wasn't directly next to it, and I would just take a tiny bit of damage and I'd have to restart. And also his dash attacks, like when he's on all fours and he's crawling towards you, sometimes one of those would get me, even though I seemed like I was a little bit outside of its range. So both of these bosses I did have to do a couple of times, maybe like 6 or 7 attempts for each one, maybe actually around 10 for Ancient Wyvern if I'm being completely honest. That fireball that just went past me on the ladder there, that doesn't actually hit me, but it certainly looked like it did, but it didn't because I was invincible because I was coming off the ladder, so I had some iframes. But that fireball that someone throws at you when you're on the ladder, that always seemed to hit me. That's like the only thing that hit me so many times on this challenge. But eventually, on the last attempt, it didn't, and I was able to beat both Osiris and the Ancient Wyvern. Before facing off against Lothric and Lorien, I wanted 2 things. The first thing was the Crystal Sage's Scroll, so I could unlock Crystal Magic Weapon and Crystal Soul Spear. And for anyone that doesn't know, a very simple way of getting this scroll is by just using Pestilent Mist or some type of poison effect on this Crystal Sage. They don't actually disappear unless you hit them with a physical attack. The next thing I wanted was a Titanite Slab, so I could upgrade to a +10 weapon. Now that that was done, it was time to take on Lothric and Lorien. This is a boss I didn't have much experience with in the past, because I normally used to play Dark Souls 3 for the PvP and for the co-op summoning and all of that type of stuff, but Lothric and Lorien, once you beat them, you don't unlock anything new. There are no new items or weapons or anything like that to acquire once you beat them. So, because I hadn't fought this boss in so long, I really did have to kind of learn their entire moveset and be able to deal with that without getting hit. It wasn't too difficult, but it did take some getting used to, and some of their attacks do come out pretty quickly, but I was able to do it in the end. For Gundyr, I was able to consistently start the fight with 3 Crystal Soul Spears, which did get him to half health, and then for the rest of the fight I basically just used Great Soul Arrows to be able to finish him off. Once Lothric and Lorien entered their second stage, it wasn't so different from the first. There were a couple of soul arrows here and there that he would sometimes fire out, but I think on this particular attempt, the one where I actually do it, nothing really changes in the second fight apart from the opening move. This made it very easy to deal with. For Gundyr, again, just using the Great Soul Arrows until the end of the fight, and I guess I'll just let the clip play out until both of them have been eliminated. At this point, there were only 3 bosses left: Aldrich, the Soul of Cinder, and the Nameless King. I put Aldrich off for a pretty long time already, so I decided I would try and fight him. I put him off for so long because I figured he had pretty high magic damage, being kind of the sorcery boss and all that. But to my surprise, when I started attacking him, he was taking like pretty solid damage. I didn't use spells against this boss, rather, because again, I thought they had high magic damage. But I probably could have, knowing now that they didn't really. But for this, I was using the Self Swords infused with the Great Magic Weapon. I'm not sure why I didn't have Crystal Magic Weapon on here, but I'm just doing it with Great Magic Weapon anyway. So when they entered their second stage, stuff did get a little bit harder. The little soul arrows that go around everywhere were really annoying to dodge at times, and the fire on the floor just meant that I couldn't get close to them, otherwise I'd just be taking damage. I did, however, end up beating them first time. I'm pretty sure this only took one attempt. It might have taken an extra one, but I'm pretty sure it only took one. So it was much better than I feared it was going to be, and it wasn't so difficult either. I put all of the boss's cinders in their rightful places before deciding if I should fight the final boss or the Nameless King. I decided I was going to fight the Nameless King because I thought it might be a little bit easier, and this is a boss that I had fought much more than the Soul of Cinder in the past. This is another one of those bosses, like the Dancer, where I kind of just kept fighting them even though I was a little bit under-leveled until I could beat them. The first stage I was very, very familiar with. I knew all of the King of the Storm's attacks, so I didn't think I would have much difficulty there. I wasn't able to land many attacks in, but when I was, I could see they were doing very decent damage. Here, I just got a little bit too close to the boss, and so they flew up and did their fire attack. For the moment, I had to run away. However, the next attack I landed on the boss did end up staggering them, which ultimately led to their demise. Now that the King of the Storm was defeated, it meant that the real challenge had just begun. Or so I thought. The Nameless King was surprisingly easy when I stayed at a longer ranges. My Crystal Soul Spears were doing pretty solid damage, and his attacks were not hard to dodge or read whatsoever. I think this is one of those bosses that's much harder at closer ranges than at longer ranges, and that worked perfectly for me. The only thing that was a little bit scary were his lightning attacks that kind of caused a chain reaction, but even those weren't so difficult to dodge. After lots of casting and not so many attempts, there was only one boss left to go. The feared Soul of Cinder. Originally, I wanted to beat this boss with my Cell Swords and with melee because I thought it would be slightly more impressive. However, in his second stage, he has probably the most annoying attack I have ever faced in this entire challenge. Like, just the most annoying attack in this entire challenge is on Soul of Cinder's phase 2, and that is his kick. And I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't figure out the timing. It was too fast for me. So eventually, I ended up relying on my spells and my Crystal Soul Spears and my Great Soul Arrows. I had to stay at long range simply because I wasn't able to dodge the kick fast enough to be able to, I just couldn't dodge it. So I'm going with spells here and casting because it just gave me an easier time. In the first phase, I was okay to do melee, but the second stage was just really, really, really hard. And I'm actually going to get to the second stage here, and I think I've talked enough for the moment, and the soundtrack's really good, so I'm just going to let this play out. And with this final blow, I had done what I set out to do. I had felled my last fiend. I had bested the last boss. I had completed the challenge. I had beaten the game at level 78 without getting hit by any of the bosses. Also, I had done that in just 17 hours. That may sound like a lot, but it really isn't that much for something that I thought would be so difficult. While linking the first flame, I reflected on how the challenge made me feel. It genuinely felt like how it did when I played the game for the first time. After dying to a boss again and again and again and feeling so frustrated, the feeling of finally beating them, the feeling of overcoming that challenge, felt almost as good as it did back then. The only thing I have left to say is thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. That is going to be it for this video. Maybe I'll do another one in the future, perhaps for Elden Ring. I know the DLC is coming up, so maybe I'll have a crack at that, though I think it's probably going to take a lot longer than this one did. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Farewell.